Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, sibling incest, it's not child's play, says guest Risa Shaw. The U.S. Supreme Court says no to medical marijuana. All the more reason the Maryland legislature should say yes, argues GOP lawmaker Don Murphy. Filmmaker Lynne Sachs takes us back to perhaps the most dramatic act of protest in Maryland against the Vietnam War. Also, the Kennedys, Pete and Maura, offer up some extraordinary guitar picking and good humor. Author Edwin Black on the alliance between Hitler and America's most powerful corporation. His book is IBM and the Holocaust. And Carolyn Joyner and Angela Boykin present romantic poetry by 19th century African Americans. Come on in. Incest, Margaret Randall writes, is the primal betrayal. It violates our first trust. It makes it painfully difficult, sometimes impossible, to trust again. A father molesting a daughter comes readily to mind, but we're talking here about the sexual abuse of one sibling by another. A recent study from Australia found that almost half of adolescent sex offenders abused a younger sibling. Still, there are no hard numbers on the prevalence of sibling sexual abuse. The offense is seldom acknowledged and even less frequently reported, whether due to fear or shame or a desire to forget. So a thank you is in order up front to Tacoma Park resident Risa Shaw for helping to break this wall of silence. Risa contributed to, collected, edited, and published Not Child's Play, an anthology of memoirs, poetry, fiction, and art about brother-sister incest. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Mark.
The title, Not Child's Play. Tell us about it.
It comes from a line in the introduction which I wrote, and it follows a section in which I talk about how sexual abuse between children is usually dismissed, how it's often minimized and delegitimized, and how it's excused, how parents and other adults often say that boys will be boys, that those sorts of things don't happen in my house, and my kids would never do that. And then I talk about also how the brothers always were aware of every creak in the stairs, or the way that the trees moved in outside of the barn, or wherever it was that they were doing what they were doing with their sisters, and how the brothers always were very careful about what they did. And so it wasn't just boys will be boys.
But how do you draw the line between what many people would consider to be normal, even healthy sexual curiosity or experimentation and molestation?
I think that there's clearly a difference, and the 35 women in the book, it's very clear from the stories that they tell. Adolescent sexual exploration is just that. It's not full of coercion and power plays and domination. It's not full of threats and ultimatums and promises made by the brothers, which is what the sibling incest is full of.
Now, we're talking about incest, and frankly, from my perspective, incest between consenting adults is their business, but we're not talking about consensual sexual relations here.
No, we're not.
We're not talking about adults.
We're not talking about adults. We're talking about children, and the stories in the book range, the girls were anywhere from 2 to 20. They talk about the incidences happening anywhere from a couple of times to, I think that there's one where there's a span of 12 years, and the brother was well into his 20s by the time the girl finally had it stopped. So we're not talking about adults, and we're not talking about people who are consenting.
What motivated you to write this book?
I'm a survivor myself, and I went looking for the book 22 years ago. There were books out at that time on incest, and brother-sister incest was sometimes mentioned, paragraph, even just a bit here or there, but there was nothing where I heard the other women who knew this same horror speak about what I knew and what had happened to me, and it never came about, and so I created it myself.
And this creation is a series of memoirs, it's poetry, it's some fiction, and it's artwork. Tell me about how you conceived of this collection.
basically I did what I wanted to have for myself. I wanted to see a variety of expressions of people's experiences, of what they've gone through, how they've worked through things, what they hoped for. And I knew that I wanted the art in it, because there's a lot that you can't say verbally, and there's a lot that you can't touch on a verbal level either. And so I knew I wanted art as well as writing, and I put out a call for contributions.
But you published this yourself?
I did. No one would pick it up. I started the collection about 12 years ago. And it started with, I told a friend of a friend that I was thinking about doing it because I wanted such a volume. And the next thing I know, a friend of hers had sent me a piece, which is actually in the book. And that was before I really decided I was going to do it. And I sent proposals out to publishers several times, probably to well over 60 or 70 publishers, and decided at one point that on my last try that if no one picked it up, that I would go ahead and do it myself, because I didn't want it to be kept silent any longer. And
you did it. Let's talk a little bit about what sibling sexual abuse is about. What do we know about the abusers, the victims? Are there things that are common in sibling sexual abuse cases?
I can speak from my own experience and the experience of the women in the book and the people who have written to me. And I think that one of the most common things is not only the power dynamics between the siblings, but also the power dynamics in the entire family and how those get handed down to the siblings.
And when you say power dynamics, explain.
I'm talking about control behaviors, control patterns, coercion, domination, manipulation.
Is it always a question of power and domination?
I believe so.
And is it, but sometimes it appears, at least on the face, to be consensual. That is, there is a desire on the part of the sister to curry favor of an older brother, for instance.
I think it probably appears to be the sister gets special attention that she wouldn't get otherwise. And we know that kids do all sorts of things for whatever they can get in different ways. I think that that does not in any way make it consensual, mitigate any
sure.
of the coercion that's going on.
And where are the parents in this situation?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. I've heard stories of parents who have basically said to the kids, just be quiet, just, go in your room, shut the door, stop being so noisy, to parents who just turn the other cheek, who say they didn't know that anything was going on, but maybe they noticed some difference in behavior between the kids, but never did anything about it.
And based upon your own experience and that of the other women reflected in this book, is it the case that the girls never went to their parents also?
No. I've got one story in the book, and it's actually the only one that I've heard, where the girl, when she was 6 or 7, there was a huge family gathering, and she stood up in the middle of the celebrations and said, by the way, this is what my brother's doing to me. And she says there was shocked silence, and it never happened again. Her brother never touched her again. And still, 34 years later, no one has ever mentioned it again in her family.
A lot of people, I think, imagine that it's a very different situation between a natural brother and sister and perhaps a stepbrother and sister. Is it different?
I don't think so.
No statistically significant difference?
I can't give you statistics, but I do know from the people I've talked to, and again, the stories in the book, that there are stories of step siblings and there are stories of siblings that are not step.
And then the other thing that seems to be a factor is the likelihood that the abuser is also an abused. Is that right?
It's often the case. There's also, in my experience, many times the abuser says no. They have no memory of being abused. They don't think they were. So often it does happen that way, and sometimes I don't know.
Are there typical stages in the process of sexual abuse of a sibling in terms of, for instance, at first fear of response, and then some major kind of outpouring of memory and emotion, and then some effort to deal with it. How does it work?
I know that there's, that the incest, the abuse, leaves the girls and the women with huge amounts of shame, a lot of self-blame. They often feel complicit in the abuse in some way because they didn't get someone to notice that it was going on or get any help. There's a lot of anger, but it's usually directed towards the self, and which just makes for a mess. And so I know that those sorts of things happen. I think that there's a lot of fear on the kid's part of telling somebody and not being believed or being blamed for it, and then all of those things get carried through into adulthood.
And so what is the healing process, if there is one?
Well, I think speaking out makes a huge difference. I think whether it's as a little girl, you tell somebody who's safe, and I would encourage any girl to do that. Or whether it's as a woman and you tell one person and then maybe you write about it. I think that as much as you can speak out about it, as privately or publicly as that might happen for you, that's what creates movement, that's what creates action.
Is there something different in the effect on the victim of sibling sexual abuse than sexual abuse by some third party?
Well, I think that the fact that it happens in the family is one layer, and that another layer is that it's a sibling, that it's supposed to be a trusted comrade, that it's supposed to be someone who you can rely on. And invariably it's the older sibling who's the abuser. So you're also looking at someone who is supposed to provide guidance and protection and is providing exactly the opposite.
This is the primal betrayal that Margaret Randall talked about in the foreword to your book. Yeah.
Exactly. They're violating you, they're betraying you in every way you could think of.
And if people want to take some action, for instance, get a copy of your book in order to help them work their way through this process, how can they do that?
We've got a website, and shall I give it?
Sure.
It's lunchboxpress.org. There are order forms there. There's also then an email address, and I could give that as well, which is lunchboxp@aol.com.
Well, many thanks to Risa Shaw for daring to tell us these stories. Again, the book is Not Child's Play. It's available from Lunchbox Press in Tacoma Park. Still to come, Lynne Sachs in her documentary about the Catonsville Nine, guitar picking and grinning with the Kennedys, Edwin Black on IBM and the Holocaust, and love poems by post-Reconstruction era African Americans. But first, it was a setback for above-ground use of marijuana as medicine. The U.S. Supreme Court recently ruled there is no medical necessity exception to the total prohibition on smoking pot under federal law. That was bad news for Larry Silberman of Rockville, who has a form of cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
The medical regime I'm on involves, adriamycin, prednisone, erythromycin, and a bunch of other chemicals, and it's really hard to get any rest with that stuff. The sleeping pills they gave us didn't work. I mean, you can only gobble so many of those things. And I started smoking a little bit of marijuana so I could get some rest. If you don't get rest during your chemotherapy, you're not going to survive it. And the idea is to live with cancer, not to die from it.
And that's a message Silberman and a small band of protesters took to the streets of Silver Spring recently. The Supreme Court's decision will shut down cannabis clubs, clubs that made marijuana available to patients who had written authorization from their doctors. But the court's decision did not expressly strike down any state laws. There are currently 8 that permit smoking marijuana for medical reasons.
What the Supreme Court opinion does for us is point out just how cruel the federal law is and why we need this at the state level.
Don Murphy has twice proposed legislation to legalize medical marijuana. This past session, his measure had 30 co-sponsors, mostly Democrats. Still, the bill didn't get out of committee. So Murphy's on a soapbox and is organizing small protests across the state to keep the issue alive.
My father died of cancer and suffered tremendously, we did not use marijuana for that treatment, in large part because I didn't realize that it was available or that it could be used and have benefits for cancer. Had I known then what I know now, I certainly would have used it for him. With all due respect to the Maryland General Assembly, I just don't care what the law is with respect to giving treatment to my loved ones and family.
Strong words, words that would be welcomed by the GOP governor of New Mexico, an outspoken critic of drug prohibition. But what about the Republican who presides in the White House?
If Mr. Bush indeed is a compassionate conservative, and I believe he is a good man, Mr. Bush could change it with a stroke of a pen by having the FDA change the classification of marijuana from a Schedule I to a Schedule II drug in the case of people who need it.
Don't hold your breath. Bush recently appointed drug war zealot and medical marijuana foe John Walters as drug czar. The Bush administration's line is, medical marijuana is already available, not the smokable kind, but the pharmaceutical Marinol, which doesn't get you high.
I myself have not tried Marinol. I have been in infusion centers. That is where you go to get infused with your chemotherapy, and I've talked to several people who are getting Marinol. And at this point in time, the best thing I've heard about Marinol is it comes in a really pretty pill.
But pretty pills may be all that's forthcoming. A Democratic co-sponsor of the Maryland medical marijuana bill told me it's dead as a doorknob, thanks to the Supreme Court. But Don Murphy is unbowed, bolstered by a poll taken after the court's decision, finding that 2 out of 3 Marylanders believe doctors should be allowed to prescribe marijuana to treat pain and AIDS in cancer patients. And Murphy holds out hope his GOP colleagues will yet see the light.
As a fairly conservative, maybe libertarian-leaning Republican, I feel that the government ought to stay out of our lives in many instances, and this is certainly no different.
Hello, and welcome to Rewind at the Coffee House, where we're going to talk about the art of documentary and the art of documenting, and specifically about one very unusual movie called Investigation of a Flame. Yes, Investigation of a Flame. It's about one day in 1968, during the Vietnam War, when a group of pacifist Christians decided to burn draft records. Now, if you're old enough, you can actually remember this. They became known as the Catonsville Nine because they burned those records in Catonsville, which, as you know, is a suburb of Baltimore and certainly was not a center of anti-war activity. And when they burned those records, they called their local TV to film that act. So, about 30 years later, Lynne Sachs moved into town. Now, she's a filmmaker, and she decided to make a movie about the Catonsville Nine. We get to see why she made that movie, how she made that movie, and in what an unusual style. Thanks for coming, and welcome to the Coffee House, Lynne.
I'm very glad to be here.
Lynne, let's start out with a look at your movie and at the very act that made the Catonsville Nine into a court case.
Okay.
May this symbolic message bring home to the American people that while people throughout the world, and especially in Vietnam now, are suffering from napalm, that these files are also napalm to show that these lives can fall in the same fate of the Vietnamese.
Amen.
We think also of those negotiating in Paris, and we ask through this action that they take their work seriously, especially the Americans, and understand that Americans are able to undergo some risk in the name of justice, in the name of the dead.
It was like just trying to put a log in the path of the government, to try to stop it, to stop and reconsider what's going on here, And that it's like a minuscule little log that you're getting into.
So, Lynne, the they filmed the act of violating the law to make their demonstration. How did you come across that information and decide to make this movie?
Well, what actually happened was that these 9 people were extremely desperate to find something that would draw the attention of the American public and of Lyndon Johnson, of anybody that was in power or anybody who could affect the people in power. So they went to a building that's about 5 minutes from where I live, called the Knights of Columbus building. It's like a bingo house now. And they knew that this was a very vulnerable building. It was one of the last of the selective service buildings that you could sort of stroll into easily. And they walked right in, and they took hundreds of draft files, took them outside, and burned them with napalm. And everything was very key. It is truly a performance with a few vital props and costumes and everything. You know, those were actually priests. 4 of them had either been priests. 2 of them were still priests. There was a woman who'd been a nun. They definitely dressed for the moment, and they were not hippies, and they chose not to present themselves as anything like radical Americans. They were people who were pretty much living in the mainstream but had very critical views of what was going on. And people, when I first moved to Catonsville, it was like this little hidden myth that something odd had happened, something very radical, which was hard to imagine there, had happened. And everybody had the dates wrong, the participants wrong, the location wrong, and so I just started to dig around, and then I became very, very consumed by it. And this is my second film on that era. I'd done another film that I actually shot in Vietnam, so it's sort of a part 2 or a continuation of this research or investigation, whatever you want to call it.
Well, how did you find the footage?
Well, I knew that there had been a reporter. His name's Patrick McGrath. He's actually now a Fox reporter in Washington. I had his name, and I spent 6 months trying to get an interview with him, and finally I just decided I wasn't going to call to confirm. I would just show up at his house. Well, he had totally forgotten, which was lucky for me because he hadn't quite planned what he was going to say. And I started the interview with him at about 7 in the morning. It had taken me an hour and a half to get there. It was like a trudging kind of thing. I started the interview, and he kind of mentioned that there had been some film footage. And I said, well, whatever happened to that film footage? He said, oh, I thought you would ask that. And it had been in his basement,
wow.
You know, his dank basement for 30 years. But videotape would never have lasted that long, but the 16 millimeter film was fine. And he handed it over to me, and I think he just believed something should happen to this material because it had never been broadcast in Baltimore or even really nationally, because he had been accused of conspiracy for even being at the location of this federal crime. And so the station wanted the material destroyed, and he took it.
How fascinating.
Yeah. It's a media study kind of moment in a lot of ways.
So he kept it for all those years,
yeah,
and then gave it over to you.
Yeah, and I will give it back to him. In fact, we just had the opening at the Maryland Film Festival, and he came, and we had this big panel afterwards, and he talked about that moment and where it played sort of in his whole career, because it was kind of a brazen act on his part to be there with his crew. I don't know if his supervisor would have approved of it, but he did it anyway. And we were trying to discuss, now what do we do with this stuff? It's so important historically. Do you put it back in your basement? Do I take it to the National Archive? What do I do with it? We're trying to figure that out right now, because
well, what you did with it in the film is really very different from what he filmed. Mm-hmm. You give us the film, and then you give us the images again and again differently and in different contexts, mm-hmm, and differently worked, and it's a very interesting reuse of the material, and mm-hmm, and I want to be able to talk some about how you used the material, but I'd like first to take a look at another section of the film, because you use different kinds of material, and we've seen one which is the original document. Let's look at another clip where you use some old news images from the era.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I think that each one carries his own impressions of what he's seen today.
It's regarded as routine by the public. And NASA itself has classified the test as non-hazardous. But
we were frankly worried about the state of euphoria that was beginning to set in on the public mind about how easy this particular thing was. You light a match at the pad, the bird goes up, everything's great. Guys come back down again, you've got some heroes.
The historical footage that signifies the era for us, what were you trying to do there? Why did you decide to pull that in, and then how did you get that stuff?
Well, those are the astronauts, landing on the moon, which actually happened in '69. So it was around the same period. I took a little liberty, I guess. But for me, it's all a mindset that I think people tend to forget, that Vietnam and this notion of soldiers going to this sort of foreign land was happening simultaneously with the whole movement and the sort of spirit of going to the space activity. I as a child dreamt of the moon. When were you going to land on the moon? And the same time, I probably had fears of what was going on in Vietnam. It was all happening at the same time, and I think that there's been this sort of obliteration of that sense of things happening at the same time.
The convergence of
and this idea of what were these heroes, what were these boys going to do, where were they going to take us?
Going to the moon and going to...
Yeah, and there was dangers in both respects, and there was a kind of sense of this would be a kind of romantic gesture. You go, you there's some kind of sacrifice for your country, and in a sense that whole relationship to war or to our civic responsibility has really changed, and I was really interested, and that's why I have that cut there which we just saw, where we go from the soldiers leaving the helicopter to the astronauts leaving the rocket, and it's all about that kind of adventure.
Well, I want to be able to get one more clip.
Okay.
Because you did not make a film that was a straightforward celebration of the Catonsville Nine. You even interviewed people who disagreed then and now with their acts, and you were even able to interview the prosecutor, who still thinks that he's done the right thing. So let's take a look at things from the prosecutor's perspective.
The law, I know what's legal, not what's right, and I'll stick to what's legal. Roper says, and you set man's law above God's? No, far below, says Moore. But let me draw your attention to a fact, Roper. I'm not God. The currents and the eddies of right and wrong, which you find such plain sailing, I can't navigate. I'm no voyager. But in the thickets of the law, there I'm a forester. I doubt there's a man alive who could follow me there, thank God, he said. And his wife then says, while you talk, he's gone. The bad guy's getting away. And go he should, says Moore, if he was the devil himself until he broke the law. And Roper, now outraged, says, so now you give the devil benefit of law? Moore, yes, what would you do, Roper? Cut a great row through the law. This country's planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down, and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I'd give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake. So, Lynne, what's he quoting there?
He's quoting the play Man for All Seasons, where the character, or the real historical figure, Thomas More, was discussed. And the reason he invokes that philosophical stance is that the prosecutor was very committed to the rule of law. And his sense of social responsibility had to do with following a kind of structure that would carry us as a society. And that if you let that fall apart, then we would fall into chaos. And so whether or not there was a rule there was a sense of God's rule, that came after the rule of man as it had been created. So I felt that it was important to have that in the film, that brought the passions of the Catonsville Nine into relief against the subject.
Before we have to go,
yeah, sure.
Tell us where we're going to see the film.
Well, the film will show again in the fall at the Charles Theater in Baltimore. It's going to also show, they're going to have another panel with all the participants at the Catonsville Community College, and then I plan to show it in Los Angeles and San Francisco, New York, probably at the Film Forum in Los Angeles. But definitely check out the MarylandFilmFestival.com, because they've been enormous supporters, and they will always know where the film's going to show, and they can be reached in Baltimore. MarylandFilmFestival.com they can find, or they can just look up the Maryland Film Festival in Baltimore.
Great. Well, thank you, Lynne, for your time and your work and your insight into the filmmaking process, and I hope you also will have more chances to stretch your expectations for movies soon. I'm Pat Aufderheide. This has been Rewind. Good luck, good viewing.
Well, howdy, Pete.
Hey,
howdy,
Dave.
Maura.
Hi, Dave.
Welcome to Tacoma Coffee House.
Great to be here.
That was all the tunes rolled into one there.
It was a medley of everything.
So when people say, what style do you play in? You say, these styles.
Exactly.
What were some of the tunes that you worked in on that one?
First there was a fiddle tune called Across the Big Sandy, and then there was another fiddle tune called Black Mountain Rag. That's kind of Doc Watson's signature song. And then we finished up with Orange Blossom Special.
There was a little blues at the end.
A little bit of blueser at the end too, and a little bit of Beethoven thrown in there too, so it was just about everything.
And Beethoven would have played that if he had a good enough
He
guitar.
was into bluegrass, yeah. Definitely. Yeah, he played a little 5-string banjo on the
He's from
side.
the South, right?
yeah, it's south of Germany.
Well, you have a new album coming out.
Yes.
And I sort of feel like I'm on one of those late night TVs. Order now.
Infomercial.
Right. Can you tell me about it a little bit?
We call it Positively Live because it's a live album, and a lot of our fans...
Yeah, I guess negatively live wouldn't...
No.
That's not the same,
that
right?
wouldn't be us.
Okay.
But a lot of our fans have been asking us for a live album for years and years, and they wanted to have an album that showcased all of Pete's guitar jamming, and so we finally put it out ourselves. Started our own little record label called Jiffy Jam.
Good.
And we're doing it ourselves now.
Jiffy Jam, not to be confused with the peanut butter and jelly, right? They'll probably want to buy that name from you.
No.
Good.
We'll sell it for big
We'll
bucks.
make more from that than we will from selling the records.
Or you could include it. It could be a giveaway. You get a jar of... when you figure this will come out in about 6 months? Sooner?
Sooner or later.
And we have the
you know
website
what, they
on it.
can, yeah, if they want to look at our website, it's kennedysmusic.com, and
I thought it was Ken and Edie. So it's Kennedy's. I get
Kennedy's.
it.
Right.
Oh, okay.
It's not like Steve and Edie.
All right, I get it. Okay, well, why don't you play one more from that?
We'll do one more song.
And what's it called?
This song is a song that I'm taking the long way around telling you the title.
Okay.
It's a song that Pete wrote years ago after he heard a drunk guy at a bar say something really ridiculous.
He turned to his buddy and he said, "Is a bullfrog waterproof?" And I mean, how could you not write a song with that line in it? Well, you know, so I wrote a song with that line, a love song.
Of course. I figured that right away.
Yeah, it's kind of a rockabilly. We love the Everly Brothers and that kind of music, so it's a little bit of like a rockabilly feel to it.
Well, take us out into that bog or good night.
It's called "I'd Run Red Lights for You."
For you, I take a hairpin turn on Dead Man's Curve in a 48 Packard coupe. It's crazy, but it's true. Let her run red lights for you. Let her run red lights for you. Let them say what they want, don't care what they say, 'cause you know I'm still your fool. It's crazy, but it's true. Let her run red lights for you. Well, my tires and tubes are doing fine, but the hair is showing through. Ask me, do I love you, baby? Is the bullfrog waterproof? Let her run red lights for you. 'Cause when I was down, you stood there grinning and you made me lose my blues. It's crazy, but it's true. Let her run red lights for you. Well, my tires and tubes, they're doing fine, but the air is showing through. Ask me, do I love you, baby? Is a bullfrog waterproof? Well, let her run red lights for you. 'Cause when I was done, might lead me on, but somehow it won't ring true. 'Cause it's crazy, you always knew. Well, let her run red lights for you. It's crazy, but it's true. Well, let her run red lights for you.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. The information highway has never been more accessible. Today there are websites and chat rooms and .coms galore, thanks to computers and the internet. All you have to do is let your fingers do the walking and your access is guaranteed. But 68 years ago there were no computers, there was no World Wide Web, and a man named Adolf Hitler needed a system, a way to count heads, to procure names. He needed a way to contain data, and he got it in the form of the Hollerith machine, a precursor to today's computer. It was a machine with punch cards manufactured by International Business Machines. You might know that corporation better by its initials, IBM. In his new book, IBM and the Holocaust, the strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and America's most powerful corporation, writer Edwin Black exposes IBM's pivotal role in World War II. His account of the economic investment made by this American corporation is riveting. Edwin Black is the son of Polish survivors of the Holocaust. He is also the author of the award-winning book, The Transfer Agreement, and he lives in Rockville, Maryland. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. You got the idea for this book at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, correct?
Well, it was 1992 when I was at the Holocaust Museum with my parents, both of whom, as you said, are Polish survivors. And the first thing you see when you come into the Holocaust Museum is this Hollerith machine. And on the front of the machine is an IBM nameplate. And these two words for me, IBM and Holocaust, did not compute. And after a long time I realized that while we have investigated the military intelligence and the diplomatic cables and the financial activities and the mechanisms of genocide,
yes,
we have not investigated information technology. And indeed, until the current age in which we find ourselves, the computer age, we could not even formulate the questions to ask, let alone create the answers to exactly what the role of information technology was. But we do know today that information technology can make the pivotal difference in any program of peace or persecution. And so I assembled a team of some 100 researchers and historians and translators working in 7 countries,
wow.
50 archives. We produced some 20,000 archival documents, and slowly the picture emerged. And that is that IBM and its president Thomas J. Watson engineered with Adolf Hitler a strategic business alliance and joint planning program right from the very beginning in 1933 and continuing right through the war. And with this technology, with this business alliance, Adolf Hitler was given the tools that he needed to accelerate and automate the 6 key phases of his war against the Jews. That's the identification, the social expulsion, the confiscation, the ghettoization, the deportation, and even the extermination of the Jews.
Yes, and you give an entire history of IBM, including Hollerith himself, before it became IBM, was German-American, is that?
Well, yes, this company was actually born German in a manner of speaking.
Yes.
And the Hollerith system was developed for the U.S. Census in the 1890s. You see, when Hitler came to power, it required the resources of a computer to undertake his mission to destroy all of European Jewry. But there was no computer. There was, as you said, the IBM punch card system. And this stored information about individuals, places, events, and other data in holes. Depending upon where you punched the hole, in which column or row you could cross-tabulate that information and get any results that you wanted. So by coding Jew in one column, Polish in another column, and speaking Polish in a third column, and being a furrier in another column, and then for Berlin, at the rate of 24,000 cards per hour, you could cross-tabulate quickly and determine exactly how many Jews of Polish extraction were in Berlin engaged in the fur trade.
Wow. You brought a copy of one of those punch cards, didn't you?
Well, yes, what I have here is actually not a punch card, but I have a prisoner card. And this is the type of card that every prisoner in a concentration camp had. If I can, I'll hold it up. And this prisoner card, this was printed in Auschwitz, and every prisoner had one of these, and it's just paper. And there are 130,000 of these at the Bundesarchiv, which is the German archive in Berlin, and they thought it had nothing to do with punch cards. But when I blew it up, I see Halrith Vermach, which means the Halrith notation system. Down here, it says verschlüsselt, which means keyed in, and here it's Lachkart geprüft.
Wow.
And this person has lost his name, and all the information is coded into certain boxes. Now, he was arrested by Kripo, which is a 2, and he was sent to Dachau, which is a 3. And if you look here at the secret code sheet for concentration camps, you see that Kripo, just as I said, is a 2, Gestapo is a 1. In addition, we find that Auschwitz is 1, we see Buchenwald is 2, and Dachau is 3. All the different types of prisoners were identified by code. For instance, the homosexuals were 2, and the gypsies were 12, and the Jews were 8. And then their type of departure was coded as well. And 1 was released, and 2 was transferred, 3 was death by natural causes, 4 was executed, and 6, code 6, was extermination. And that means that an IBM engineer had to decide with his Nazi client that IBM, that they would code 6, whole 6, for extermination, and the punch cards were then printed up exclusively by one company, and that was IBM.
Wow, wow. And also the train systems throughout Europe, weren't they also tied in with the Hallerith system?
Yes, these machines did far more than identify. Everything you do today with a computer just about, you could do back then, but slower. And so all the trains ran in and out based upon the Hallerith machines. Normally it would take, without a Hallerith machine, it could take 2 or 3 weeks to identify where a boxcar was. But with the Hallerith punch card system, you could identify where the boxcars were within just 1 to 2 days. And so there are hundreds of concentration camps, and millions of people of all persuasions and nationalities are going through them during the 12-year Reich. But the one-day capacity of all concentration camps is only 300 to 500,000. That's traffic management, and IBM devised the specific custom-made program to make that a reality.
And what's so fascinating about this book is that you talk about the technology as you're talking about it now, the whole system, the punch cards, and you talk about the human actions and atrocities in the same at the same time. That you're juxtaposing the information about the technology along with this human, abomination.
Well, because the atrocities were the vicious, bloody, more visible side of this Holocaust. But behind the atrocities, there was a massive bureaucratic undertaking. There was efficiency. We've all heard of German efficiency.
Yes, right.
But what this book reveals and what the documentation shows, that as much as there was German efficiency, there was American innovation.
And also, the Hallerith machine and IBM worked with the Allies, correct? We have about 3 minutes. So to talk about...
Well, everything that Watson and IBM was doing for Adolf Hitler, he was also doing for the Allies. He was involved in the Normandy crossing, predicting the weather, in trajectories, in the Hiroshima bomb, in recruitment. They were even making rifles. In point of fact, IBM and Watson, they were bigger than the war, bigger than Hitler, bigger than the Allies. No one could afford to prosecute their attempt to dominate without IBM.
Amazing. And the tattooed numbers are Hallerith numbers?
The original tattoo on the forearm of the Auschwitz prisoners was the Hallerith number. It was an IBM-compatible number.
It's amazing. Also, with Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor happened, then weren't the Japanese Americans then listed on the census through Halleriths? Is that, am I getting that wrong?
IBM was actually working very closely with the imperial government to develop their aircraft industry.
Okay.
I guess that's somebody else's book. In addition, when the Japanese were picked up in 1942, they were identified by the census tract through this Hollerith program, through various Hollerith programs.
Yes, in this 1 minute we have left, I have to say, it's chilling that we're going through all this stuff with the census now, and to look back at something that happened not very long ago and all the information that was available.
I think what we need to do is we need to have a code of ethics for corporations where they will not use their technology to afflict innocent civilians. And we have yet to come to that point, and we have yet even to get IBM to acknowledge its guilt, its involvement, or open its archives. We won't really know the full magnitude of what IBM did until they open all its archives around the world, and this they refuse to do.
Which is amazing. Well, I'm so glad that you've done this book, though, because you've cracked it wide open.
Thank you.
It's really... Thanks to Edwin Black for joining me in the coffee house. Again, his new book is IBM and the Holocaust. Coming up, romantic love in the poetry of African Americans from Reconstruction to the new Negro Renaissance. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
Yet, sweet, sweet dove, when life is drear, come chant again that dreamy lay. O tender love, send shining stars to light her soul once more someday.
Miss Ray made her public debut as a poet in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1876. To commemorate the Emancipation Proclamation and honor the emancipator, African Americans donated $17,000 for a Freedmen's Monument. Miss Ray's poem, Lincoln, was read at the ceremony where Frederick Douglass was the keynote speaker, and the event was attended by President Grant. Henrietta Cordelia Ray, a skilled poet, Howard University Law School graduate, and first black female lawyer in Washington, D.C. Frances E.W. Harper, the protest poet, and the first published female novelist of African American descent. George Moses Horton, the first Southern black man to publish poetry in America.
Do you blame me if I loved him? If when standing all alone, I cried for bread, a careless world pressed to my lips a stone?
Can you blame me that I did not see beneath his burning kiss, nor even hear the deadly adder hiss?
Can you blame me if I've learned to think your hate of vice a sham, when you so coldly crushed me down and then excused the man?
No golden weights can turn the scale of justice in his sight, and what is wrong in woman's life, in man's cannot be right.
I love thee from the earliest dawn, when first I saw thy beauty's ray, and will until life's eve comes and beauty's blossom fades away. And when all things go well with thee, with smiles or tears, remember me. I'll love thee when thy morn is past and wheatling gallantry is o'er, when youth is lost in age's blast and beauty can ascend no more. And when life's journey ends with thee, oh then look back and think of me. Paul Laurence Dunbar was dubbed the poet laureate of the Negro race. He demonstrated the talent to feel the Negro life aesthetically and the craftsmanship to express it lyrically. He is known for lively and genial verse in black dialect, although most of his poetry is written in standard English. Go and quit that noise, Miss Lucy. Put that music book away. What's the use to keep on trying? If you practice till you gray, you can't start no notes flying like the ones that rants and rings from the kitchen to the brick woods when Melindy sings. Ain't you never heard Melindy? Blessed soul take up the cross. Look here, ain't you joking, honey? Well, you don't know what you lost. You ought to hear that gal a-wobbling, robin's locks and all them things, hides their mouths and hides their faces when Melindy sings. Fiddling man just stop his fiddling, lay his fiddle on the shelf. Mockingbird quit trying to whistle because he just so shamed himself. Folks are playing on the banjo, draps their fingers on the strings. Bless your soul forgets to move them when Melinda sings. She just spreads her mouth and hollers, "Come to Jesus, 12 you hear." Sinners trembling, steps and voices, timid like are drawing near. Then she turns to Rock of Ages. Simply to the cross she clings, and you find your tears are dropping when Melinda sings.
I know why the caged bird sings, ah me. When his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free, it is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouthed with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to thee for tortured souls arise. We sing, but, oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Now, see you next time in the Coffee House.
For the harsh realities of life, Volunteers of America offers help and hope. Find out how you can help. Call 1-800-899-0089.
It doesn't look like it right now, but these people are shifting the balance of power all over the world. Oren Gleish is fighting the president of Colombia. Stephanie Jemison is one of the most feared women in Bangladesh. And Stella Mason is a dangerous element, according to the government of China. These people are all members of Amnesty International. When Oren writes a letter to the president of Colombia, innocent citizens might not be rounded up and killed. When Stephanie sends a fax to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, innocent women might not be beaten. When Stella sends an email to the President of China, innocent Chinese citizens might not be tortured. And if enough members write in, these things might never happen again. Join Amnesty International during our 40th anniversary and pressure human rights abusers to stop what they're doing right from your home. Amnesty International.
Life is like a race. Sometimes you win, and sometimes it seems everything is against you. When it feels like you're losing the race, the Girls and Boys Town National Hotline can give you the tools and confidence to get back on track. Just call 1-800-448-3000. Any problem, anytime. We're here for you. The Girls and Boys Town National Hotline.